Let's go. I did release a course on the Jobava London system with my good friend, Grandmaster Alexander Bortnyk. The link to that course will be in the description to the next few YouTube videos, including this one. And I'll redirect you to the video where I kind of advertise and preview the course more specifically. So in a couple of the subsequent games, I did want to introduce the Jobava London and show a couple of cool lines from the course. So this will be sort of in parallel to the main speedrun recommendation, which is, of course, 1e4. We had one Jobava London game already, and in that game I did preview the course. This was a few games ago. But anyways, let's focus on the task at hand. We are facing the move 1g6, and when you're a d4 player, you have to be flexible if you want to be a principled, serious opening player, in the sense that when you face moves like g6 or d6 or e6, there's no dispute that the best way to quote-unquote punish these openings is to play principled chess, right? If you're a London player, you're a d4, c4 player, if you want to really fight for advantages in every game in principled fashion, then investing some time studying certain d4, e4 openings is very much worthwhile. And this doesn't necessarily make you an e4 player. This doesn't mean that these openings have nothing to do with the more mainstream lines like the Sicilian and the Ruy Lopez, and you can study them from the white side even if you're not too familiar with ideas inherent in 1e4 openings. This, I think, is a big misconception, which is that, let's say you're a London player and you say, well, if I play e4, I have to know the ideas that attend to 1e4 openings. Not at all. This is its own thing, and you can study this as its own thing. You don't have to be an e4 player to crush an opening like the modern consistently, okay? And hopefully this game is going to show that I am an e4 player, but I'm going to try to show that these openings are pretty approachable, and you can learn them without investing 30 hours into, learning an entire chessable course or learning a ton of theory. This is, of course, the modern, and we have a wealth of options against the modern, starting from this position where we can develop either the knight to f3 or the knight to c3. I've also previously played the move pawn to c3 in previous speedrun games in order to take this bishop out of commission. But let's play principal chess in this game. Let's go knight c3, which is, of course, the main move. And it's also the most flexible move because you reserve the ability to push the pawn up to f4. That is the Austrian attack, which is the most principled way of meeting the perk. But we're right now facing a different system. This is called the Gurgenidze system, named after Georgian grandmaster Buhudi Gurgenidze. And this has been around really since the 50s and 60s. Hikaru loves to play this system with black and blitz games because it's an easy system to play. And oftentimes the center gets really locked up. So if white is unfamiliar with the main ideas, you can really get a problematic position. Now, white's main move in this position is still to play f4, but that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to introduce you to a very practical system against the Gurgenidze, which gives white a very easy position to play. Black can equalize against this system with ultra-precise play, but it's practical in the sense that most players, I think, under 2300 will probably not be familiar with the correct pathway and will not reproduce it to the most precise extent. What we do here is start with the move bishop to e3. You can also start with the move f3. I think bishop e3 is more flexible, right? You want to reserve the pawn moves and delay them until you absolutely have to play them, whereas you know that bishop e3 is a nice developing move as it is. Black is not obliged to play d5. And I would define the Gurgenidze as a cross between the Caro-Kann and the modern, right? So black tries to get the best of all worlds, and the move bishop e3 is helpful even if black deviates and goes d6 and transitions back into like a perk setup. Bishop on e3 is a very, very good piece, whereas we're not totally sure that we in fact want to put the pawn on f3. But now that black has played d5, we basically are playing the fantasy variation. My official recommendation against the Caro-Kann, as you hopefully know, is the fantasy. So if you strip away these two minor pieces and this piece, we actually just have a fantasy, and it's quite clear that the moves knight c3 and bishop e3 have not detracted from the effectiveness of our setup. To the contrary, that's actually where the bishop often belongs in the fantasy, and the knight, of course, is usually developed to c3 as well. So there's only one move, as far as I know, that allows black to fight for equality. All other moves give white an excellent position, and it's easy to lose this very, very quickly if you're not ultra accurate with black. A lot of players just don't have a good sense of where the pieces belong here, and one of the biggest draws of the move f3 is that black experiences problems with their knight on g8. In the Gurgenidze system, you might have seen, like Hikaru and others, bring the knight out to h6. Here, this move is not sensible because white plays queen d2. The f5 square is protected. That's the key. That's why we're delaying the move e5. Meanwhile, if black plays knight f6, that also walks into e5, and black has to lose yet another tempo, shifting the knight back toward a very awkward square, such as d7. Our opponent counterstrikes in the center. I will admit that I'm not familiar with this move, and perhaps neither is our opponent. But this is a move which isn't justified from a general principle standpoint, because we are the ones with a lead in development. Black is blasting open the center, which should favor the side that has more pieces developed. In this case, it's us. And I don't think that we should overthink it, right? Hey, our opponent wants to open up the center. I am absolutely game. The one thing that you should notice is that after pawn takes e5, which I think is what we're going to play, I don't see the reason. I don't particularly see a compelling reason to take the pawn on d5. We can do it on the next move. What you should notice, though, is after d takes e, black does not have the move d4. You should make a mental note to yourself that these pieces are unforkable squares, but d4 doesn't work because we have two defenders on that square, and black has only one attacker. So I think the best, most flexible way to continue is first and foremost to take on e5. You want to open up the center? I'm more than happy to do that. And if black recaptures with a bishop, I don't see a reason that we can't just then take on d5 and hunt for the extra pawn. Alternatively, we could focus on quickly developing our queen side with queen d2 and long castle in order to exert more pressure on the d5 pawn. That leads to some interesting tactical complications. Queen d2 here may seem to be a blunder due to d4, but if you look a little bit further, in that position we can castle queenside and black can't move the d-pawn because the queen's going to hang with checkmate. But black can support the d-pawn by playing c5, and I'm not totally convinced that that's the way to go. I mean, other than e takes d5, perhaps there's like bishop to d4 trying to get the dark squared bishops off the board and really underscore the weakness of the dark squares on the king side, but that just seems a little bit too fancy. I think that we should start with the move e takes d5, and depending on how black responds, we will either try to solidify our extra material or we will focus on getting our king out of the center, because you should remember that when you play the move f3, you make rather serious weaknesses in your center and on your king side. In particular, the bishop on e3 loses its support. Why is that important? Well, if black plays knight f6 and then castles and puts a rook on e8, we're going to have to be really, really careful, because that bishop on e3 is going to get caught in the crossfire. And the last thing that you want is a king stuck in the center after you've played the move f3 and after black's gotten a rook to e8. So our biggest priority here, apart from making sure that this pawn remains healthy, is perhaps an even bigger priority is to go queen d2 and long castle and get the king to safety so that we can focus on operating properly on the king side. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, pawn takes d5. So this poses us with a dilemma. Do not play queen takes d5. That drops the queen to bishop takes c3 because that is a check. We could play knight takes d5. And in response, I presume that black wants to play bishop takes b2. But there's a move I like even more than knight takes d5. This pawn is now an isolated pawn. Technically, it's an IQP. This is not the usual IQP setups that we tend to get, but it's still an IQP structure. The pawn on d5 is a serious weakness. So the move I am very tempted to play is still queen to d2. And in contrast to playing it here, what's the chief difference? Well, after queen d2, d4, long castle, black doesn't have another pawn to defend d4 with. And if black plays there the move knight to c6, who can tell me a way in which we can indirectly reinforce the pressure on the d4 pawn? I think that move, that resulting move, is super important. And it's the move bishop f1 to b5. And the secondary point of that move is that if black then takes on e3, we take on d8, and the knight on c6 is pinned. So because of that line, I think queen d2 it works out tactically. And so it just makes a lot more sense to me to develop quickly rather than trying to greedily capture the pawn and get into tactical complications after bishop takes b2. Maybe those complications favor white, I don't know. But in this speedrun, we're trying to play simple, straightforward chess whenever possible. So again, the line that we had to calculate is d4, long castle. Black can't take because the queen hangs. And knight c6 is always met with bishop b5. Okay, our opponent develops himself, knight e7. I think we continue with our plan. We long castle anyway, and we exert additional pressure on the d5 pawn. What you should note here is that our advantage is not just based on the weakness of the d5 pawn. It's not like if we don't win that pawn, then the position is equal. We're also better from a positional standpoint because we have control of the square in front of the pawn. And as you know from previous discussions of IQP structures, that's like the first thing that you should be paying attention to. Who's got this control of the square in front of the isolated queen pawn? If it's us, then we can put a knight on that square, and that's a pretty juicy knight, let alone that in the modern and in the purates, white's main plan is to attack the king side. Presumably, black's going to castle at some point, and then we're going to like full send the pawns down the king side. The bishop on e5 is also really awkward. It can be targeted with a well-timed bishop d4, so we can further soften up the dark squares on the king side. I don't think that we should rush necessarily with bishop d4. I think it's a move we can really play whenever we want to. So bishop d4 is a reasonable alternative, but the move that I really like here, I think the positional approach is either to play bishop b5 check and then knight e2, but even better is, I think, the immediate knight to e2, quickly aiming for d4. We're trying to plant a knight on d4 just to make sure that this pawn remains immobilized. And the moment black castles kingside, which hopefully happens sooner rather than later, we're going to send the pawn down and try to blast open the h-file and just go for checkmate. Let's go knight d4 and establish the knight on this blockading square. Okay, so what happens if there's a trade? Well, generally, if there's an isolated queen pawn, trades favor the side that is fighting against it. And one way to think about that is, okay, your opponent has finite resources and finite minor pieces. If, let's say, 2 minor pieces are traded, then both of black's remaining 2 minor pieces are going to have to be fully focused on protecting the isolated queen pawn. That means black doesn't have the resources to allocate to other things, like, let's say, defending the king. Okay, so the less pieces there are, the more valuable the remaining pieces become, and the less resources you have to spend on like one particular task. Queen to d7. Okay, so our opponent keeps the tension. I think we should also make a move that kind of keeps the tension. Of course, we can already play h4, which is a pretty helpful move. I mean, even if black stays in the center, opening up the h-file is still a pretty decent idea, but I don't think that we should commit to anything in particular. I think we should continue accumulating the pressure in whichever way we can. There's 2 ways that I see to do that. The first is, of course, the move bishop b5, which I think is probably on your radar. The second is just to play king to b1, which is a very helpful move. Almost every single time that you castle queenside, it's a good idea to throw in the move king b1, just because the king is safer on b1 than it is on c1. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail after the game. Which of these 2 moves are we going to decide on? It's hard to say. It's hard to say which move is better. I like bishop b5 because it pins the knight and it takes away the option of knight takes d4. But I like king b1 because it's super flexible. And I really feel like the king is so much safer on b1 than it is on c1. There's a concrete line I'm trying to calculate after bishop b5. And I can't tell if it's good or bad for white. Let's go bishop b5. Let's develop the bishop. Let's develop the bishop. And obviously from a practical time management standpoint, you know, these dilemmas you normally don't want to spend too much time on, because chances are, right, if you use your intuition, chances are this is not going to decide the game. The decision that you make at this point is not going to decide the game, because you know approximately likelihood is that both of these moves are about the same. Maybe one is a little more accurate than the other, but you don't want to spend 5-6 minutes making these minuscule decisions, right? You just have to have the executive judgment to know when to spend a lot of time on a critical moment. And when there are 2 moves that do similar things and that are similar in nature, you don't want to spend most of the time like more than maybe a minute or two in a 15-minute game. Castle's queenside, that was on my radar. I didn't take this move too seriously because it felt like Black's king is so flimsy with the c-file open and with Black's pawn cover already ruined. This just felt pretty brazen, but I guess it makes sense. I mean, the king is safer here than it is in the center. But it should be pointed out that we don't have any obvious checkmating procedure. There's no way for us to launch a direct attack against Black's king. I think our general strategy here just has to be a couple of moves that improve our position, right? We have to accumulate, and eventually something is going to be there, I trust, in the center. Let's start with the move king b1. Let's just get this out of the way so that we don't have to think about it in the future. Let's go king b1. And maybe we could have won a pawn. Now that I'm looking at this, we could have maybe taken the bishop on e6 and then played bishop takes a7. But I don't know if I want to part ways with this juicy knight on d4. Our opponent does the same. King b8. Great. Okay. Now let's continue playing positionally. And what playing positionally often means, not only just like improving your position, but also trading off your opponent's strongest piece or strongest pieces. To me, the bishop on e5 is one of the pieces that it's a glue piece. It holds Black's position together. It controls a lot of critical squares. So the moment the king moves to b8, it's aligned with the bishop. There is a move I'm thinking about, and we're going to play this move because it has no downside. Not f4. Not f4. f4 merely chases the bishop back to its home square. It does the same thing on g7 that it does on e5. In fact, I would say it's even safer on g7. Rather than chasing the bishop away, let's trade the bishop off with bishop to f4. So the tactics work out for us. Knight takes d4 is not even possible because the knight is pinned. And so is the bishop. So Black can't take the knight on d4. If Black plays the move f6 and tries to trade on his own terms, then the bishop on e6 loses its supporter. And that wasn't palatable either. Okay, we traded the bishops. We're making some progress. We've got a very pleasant position, and we just need to continue accumulating the pressure, right? At this level, a lot of games are won exactly in this way. You just make improving moves, and eventually, of course, you're going to have to transform your advantage into something tangible. But as long as there are obvious improving moves, you want to continue making them, and one of them is just to bring the rook to e1. This is a move everybody should see and understand. You're just bringing the rook to an open file, nothing extraordinary, putting pressure on the bishop. And in these types of positions, you have to constantly keep generating and coming up with new ways to improve your position. Your opponent's turn is a great time to do that because on your turn, you're thinking a little bit more concretely about what to do. So what are some ways that we can accumulate even further pressure on Black's position? Well, I was going to say queen to f6, but we're faced with a new challenge, queen to d6. Okay. So let me think about this for a hot second. I think we have some tactics. I think we have a perfect opportunity to take the positional advantage and transform it into something more tactical. This is an advanced concept. This is an advanced procedure. I'm not going to pretend that this is elementary. It's not. How did I find this? Well, one of the things I noticed is that after the queen trade, there is an alignment of the rooks. Okay, everybody should see this. The rook on d1 and the rook on d6 are on open files. The rook on d6 is also undefended. So we have a procedure that first and foremost opens up the d file. So first and foremost, we take the bishop on e6. Very importantly, this move defends the queen, right? Otherwise, we would just be blundering the queen. Now, from a positional standpoint, this is a counterproductive move because we're actually rectifying Black's pawn structure in the center. But what we're actually doing is we're shifting the focus from the d file to the e file. You can think of this as creating a new weakness, shifting Black's main weakness from d5 to e6, which is now an isolated pawn, and it's targeted by the white rook. Now we trade queens to get Black's rook onto the most exposed square possible, and hopefully you see where this is going. The rooks are staring at each other. The pawn on e6 is weak. It's defended only by the rook on d6, and the crucial move is knight to e4, hitting the rook, using tactics to force the rook back to either d7 or d8. And then the final step is going to be to launch a frontal attack on the pawn on e6. There's more tactics that make this work. If Black plays rook to d8, you can't play rook takes e6. The rook can't jump over the knight, and the knight is also hanging now that the rook is on a defended square. Where do we go with the knight? You need to be very accurate here. You need to be very, very accurate here. If you play the tempting knight to c5, some of you might be thinking of this move, black can actually push the pawn to e5. Remember, that is a way that your opponent can defend a pawn that's attacked more than once and defended 0 times. You can actually push the pawn and put it on a new square. No, you need to go knight to g5 because you need to pose a double attack. This is a double attack. It's a double attack in the literal sense. We're attacking the pawn twice, but it's also a double attack in the more classic sense because we're posing a second threat. We're threatening knight f7, forking the rooks, and black presumably is going to defend the f7 square or move one of the rooks, and then we're going to win the pawn on e6. And once the pawn on e6 collapses, likely so will the pawn on d5. That pawn is going to lose its supporter, and we're going to go after that pawn next. So we're going to try to win, in the end, 2 pawns in the endgame. And I'll expand a little bit on how exactly I found this idea after the game. Largely, this was pattern recognition. It's not like I actually went through, a 5-minute logical process and made observations. I saw this kind of instinctively, but this is what I try to do in the speedrun, to kind of translate my subconscious thoughts into a conscious series of steps that you can follow to find a similar idea in your game. All right, so I'm assuming our opponent's going to move one of the rooks somewhere. Yeah, the fact that our opponent is investing like 4 or 5 minutes now in this move tells us all we need to know. Rook c8, that's a good move. I think that's the best move. It's the lesser evil. Now we need to quickly decide, what are we going to take on e6 with? It's not a given that we take with a knight. That's probably the more natural move to most of us. But rook takes e6, a serious case could be made for taking on e6 with the rook, in the sense that it keeps the immediate pressure on the knight on e7, and it does threaten to win a second pawn. We're actually threatening there to take on c6, force the knight to recapture, and then to take the pawn on d5. I don't really want to part ways with my bishop if I can help it, but it will be worth paying that price for a second pawn. What worries me slightly after rook takes c6 is a weird move like knight f5, and then the other knight is threatening to jump into d4. There's like fork ideas, and in the interest of time, I'm also trying to play in a way that corresponds with the amount of time we have left. Knight takes c6 is just a simpler move to handle, right? Generally, in the endgame, you want your rooks operating from a distance. You don't want them on the front lines because they start, you know what I'm talking about, right? When you have a rook that's battling minor pieces at close quarters, I have a million examples of this. There's more tactics, there are more forks, and you run the risk of, walking into something like an ill-timed knight d4. What about knight f7? Knight f7 is reasonable, but I didn't see the point of that. Okay, a6. Where does our bishop go? Well, our main priority is to attack the d5 pawn. The moment you tell this to yourself, the move should become very obvious. You have to play bishop a4 because the bishop can later drop back to b3 and exert direct pressure on d5. Yeah, bishop a4, bishop b3 is just El Clasico kind of maneuver. What's great about the placement of the knight on e6 is that it's also controlling the d8 square. So on top of everything else that black is experiencing, he can't put a rook on d8. The knights are totally immobilized as well. We're attacking d5, so the other knight can't move. The knight from c6 can move. Where will it go? Its mobility in the center is greatly restricted. Black can barely move here. You might be sitting there with the white pieces thinking, man, I don't know if I'll be able to convert this. I'm getting nervous. But if you put yourself in your opponent's shoes, black literally is just out of moves. So however nervous you might feel, it's generally going to be infinitely more difficult to be your opponent in these types of situations than it is to be the side that converts the advantage. Another good move to just throw in, if we have the time, and we certainly have the time, because black has no counterplay, is just make some luft. We can do that with the move c3, which kills 2 birds with 1 stone. It also fully immobilizes the d5 pawn, making sure that d4 isn't going to happen. It's harder to shoot at a moving target. Or, of course, we can play the more straightforward a3. And if we had 30 seconds at this point, I would definitely play a3, right? The less time you have, the more you have to ensure yourself against the possibility of some freak tactic that you might not have the time to see. So if this was a bullet game, I would definitely be playing a3 on the next move. Now, how do I know that we should play a move like a3? Well, it's all about whether or not your opponent has counterplay, right? Does your opponent have a clear path that he can follow in order to generate counterplay? If the answer is yes, then you're generally in a bit more of a hurry Here the answer is no, because black has no squares for any of their pieces. Bishop back to b3. Okay, that's where we wanted to go anyway, but there was nothing better. Rook e8 is a good move. That's a tricky move, because if we take on d5, then black will recapture with the knight. We take with the rook, and our knight on e6 there is a little bit awkward, right? Because it's pinned to the rook on e1 that's going to lose its defender. So I don't want anything to have to do with bishop takes d5. There's no rush. That pawn isn't going anywhere at all. So let's focus on improving our position such that when we take the pawn, we won't have to deal with the fallout, and we won't have to rely on tactics to get our knight out of e6. The move that I mentioned earlier, I think it's a perfect time to play it. Let's go c3. Wait, actually, let me think about this for a second, because c3, maybe he's got knight a5. Oh, but then we've got knight g7. That's beautiful. c3. Yeah, I love the move c3, because another thing to notice, and you notice these things by avoiding tunnel vision, right? It's easy to tunnel in on the d5 pawn and forget that there are other tactics that could have nothing to do with the pawn on c5. Anytime there's contact between pieces, you have to notice that the rook on e1 is not making direct contact with the knight on e7, but it could be making direct contact after a certain something move. So we're just going to take on b4. And I played that move quickly to lure my opponent into recapturing quickly, which I think he might have smelled a rat, but at this point it's too late. No, he didn't. And by not tunnel visioning, you are going to be able to find a move that wins on the spot. Now the knight on e7 is what we call a type 2 undefended piece. It's only protected by one other piece. If you can dislodge that rook from e8, well, then likely you're going to win the knight on e7, because the rook can't maintain contact with the knight. There's no 9th rank. What's the move? It's not bishop a4. I tricked you. Some of you might say, it's bishop a4. No, because then the rook moves and the white rook can't jump over the knight. You need to do two things at once. You need to move the knight away and attack the rook. Can you do that? You absolutely can. And that's the move knight g7, fianchettoing the knight. And that ends the game. That ends the game. Yeah, knight g7 is one of those like geometric moves that can be hard to spot, because your brain doesn't often associate like the g7 square for your opponent with like a knight being there. But the more concrete you're thinking, the more specifically you formulate questions to yourself, the likelier it is that you see a relatively unorthodox tactic. And obviously, like, making observations does not guarantee that you will find a tactic. It raises the probability that you see stuff. And it raises the amount of things that you see. So by not tunneling in on the d5 pawn, we were able to find this move. If we had tunneled in on the d5 pawn, we would have certainly played the move a3. That is the move I would play if I was just obsessed with winning this pawn. I'd say, oh, well, let's get the knight out of b4 and then let's take the pawn. Obviously, knight g7 is quite a bit sexier. Let's take the rook. And what's ironic is that now the second idea comes into play. This is awesome. First, we win one rook by playing knight g7. Now we can try to win the second one by playing the move that some of you wanted to play initially. Now it's time for bishop to a4. I love that the bishop dropped back to b3 in order to attack d5 and now moves up again to a4, where it encounters greener pastures. The game is over. If black blocks with knight c6, we of course simply take the knight, and then we take on e8. And the opening experiment was a success. So as we get into the analysis, once again, the link to my Jobava London course is going to be in the description of this video, as is going to be the link to a preview video that tells you all you need to know about the course. But in this game, it was not meant to be, and we deviated on move 1. Of course, after d4, black is not obliged to play the moves d5 or knight f6. That's what you're going to face 90% of the time, but you have to have responses prepared against some of the other moves in this position. I'm talking f5, e6, b6, and you can learn most of those, in like a couple of well-allocated days. The Jobava London itself happens after knight f6, knight c3, d5, and bishop f4. This is the starting position of the course. Okay, so in this game, we faced the move g6. This is, of course, the modern defense, and I would call this the close sibling of the Pirc. The Pirc, or the Perk, as some of us call it, is d6, of course, white plays generally e4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. The modern is, I think, called that because black delays the development of the knight. And this is a somewhat cagier version of the periods. You might say, well, what's the utility of delaying the move knight f6? Well, by delaying this move, black opens up more possibilities for themselves. So, for example, after e4, bishop g7, knight c3, okay, our opponent played the Gurgenidze. That's one thing you can't really do with the Pirits because you already have a pawn on d6. So this is one thing. Another very common continuation that's unique to the modern, after d6, I was planning to play f4 and go into the Austrian attack. Here you can transpose into the Pirits with knight f6, but you can also play a move that I think is sometimes known as Tiger's Modern, named after a Swedish GM, Tiger Hillar Persson. If you're interested in exploring this line from black's perspective, he wrote a book called Tiger's Modern that I've heard really good things about. So this is a serious opening for black. The reason I don't recommend it at all to anybody under, say, 2200 is because you need to know reams of opening theory, and you need to know it in order to avoid getting completely crushed. So this opening guarantees essentially that you will have winning chances, but it also guarantees that you have quite a few losing chances. So I won't talk about a6 here because we have plenty to discuss in the context of the Gurgenidze. So c6 enters the Gurgenidze. I actually am curious whether Gurgenidze was the first player to play the move c6. I'm going to bet no. And I'm going to ask you guys a trivia question. And let's say the question is as follows. Do we think that this position occurred for the first time before 1900 or after 1900? I have a guess, but I'm curious what people think. When did this position first occur in tournament practice? And if you're watching on YouTube, you can try to make a guess. Yeah, we're pretty much split down the middle. I'm going to guess after. I'm going to guess 1940. I'm going to guess 1940. Let's see. And the answer is 1953. And and this is cool. It was first played by Genrikh Kasparian, who was an international master from Armenia, and he's more well known as a study composer. He's a super famous study composer, and studies are invented chess positions that serve as really beautiful chess puzzles. He was the first person to play this. Gurgenidze, I see his name, but he was maybe like the 10th or 11th player to play this move in 1968, 15 years later. Igor Zaitsev was the third person to play this. He was Anatoly Karpov's second and one of his most loyal assistants, also a grandmaster. So it's really interesting to see how these openings start to acquire popularity. Anyways, the main line, of course, is still to play f4. Black responds with d5. And you might look at this and say, well, this looks like black's bishop is terrible. But what black has accomplished by playing this kind of cross between the modern and the Caro-Kann is that black has carved out these light squares on the king side. You guys should see how, well, first of all, the f5 square, the g4 square, the e4 square, there's a kind of a complex of weak light squares, and black can orient his play around those light squares. That is why you see black playing h5. This is the main move. It is intended to prevent g4 and to secure the f5 square for the bishop. If you play bishop f5 immediately, you walk right into g4. After h5, white generally responds with knight f3, and the black knight is developed to h6. If you understand the high-level approach, these moves should not be a mystery to the knight. Where is it going? Well, it's going to one of these weak light squares. And if white is not well-versed in this structure, white can get a really bad position really fast. What's an example of that? Well, a lot of people, they play the move h3 because they kind of want to prepare g4. If you play this move prematurely, you're actually creating even more weaknesses on the king side because you can't easily play g4. Of course, here the rook hangs on h1. But if you don't play g4, if you make, a random developing move, who can tell me a typical move? You see this often in the Gurgenidze that essentially prevents g4 once and for all. And this is a worthy move to note. This also occurs very often in the King's Indian. This exact idea is common in the King's Indian from black side. I'm talking about the move h4. How does this permanently prevent g4? Well, obviously black has en passant, and in order to start surrounding this pawn, white has to give away the light squared bishop. Now these squares are even weaker and black has the bishop pair. So you can definitely explore some of the Gurgenidze on your own. And from a computer standpoint, if you turn on the engine most of the time, depending on which engine, Stockfish, I think, does recommend the move f4. And white is better. If white handles this position very accurately, white is definitely better. But in this game, I wanted to choose something a little bit more practical. Let me show you how this is similar to the King's Indian. In the King's Indian, in many lines, you get a situation, d6. Let's go down the Petrosian variation, which is an early d5. Just as an example. So you often get this type of situation. The knight gets to c5, and it exerts pressure on e4. So now you play a5. You've probably seen me do this a million times. You do that to prepare to prevent b4. And a lot of players who are newer to the King's Indian, from the white side, they tend to play the move a3, thinking, well, I'm just going to play b4 in one fell swoop. And of course, you run into a4. This is a very nasty construction because white can basically never play the move b4. And on top of that, black gets a really nice outpost for the knight, and then black can solidify the a4 pawn with the move bishop to d7. Okay, so again and again, as you get to a higher level, as you gain rating, this is worthwhile to do, like to see similarities between openings that you play and openings that you see in high-level chess. That way you build a more comprehensive picture of chess as a whole. And the higher rated you are, the wider and broader your chess education and your chess knowledge has to be, because you're going to get more and more diverse types of positions out of the opening because people are going to be playing different stuff. They're going to know it. And so it pays to be familiar with different types of structures and different types of ideas across many openings. Okay, so after c6, we decided on bishop e3, and we decide to build up the pawn chain with the move f3. So a little bit of theoretical overview. The most popular move in this position for black is d takes e4. This, I believe, is not the correct move. It's the move I think that you will face very, very often. And after pawn takes e4, it is common for black to counterstrike in the center with e5. But after e5, black is clearly worse. White takes on e5. And generally, black trades queens here. If black takes on e5 right away, well, this is an even worse version because here you can trade queens on your own and get your knight out, and you just get an overwhelming development advantage in this type of position. I mean, just look at this. Bishop c4, castle, queen side. It's already +3. This is out of the question. So most of the time, black takes the queen, white takes back. And here, I've had this position against Hikaru quite a few times. Bishop takes c5 is a mistake because it walks right into knight f3. 10 games in the database, and black is in massive, massive trouble. Bishop g7, bishop comes out to c4. And there's tactics galore on all sides of the board. After something like knight d7, white castles, look at the pressure on the f file here. Black can't get their pieces out at all. Knight gf6, walks into e5. 2342 had this position in 2009, knight g4. And now after bishop to d4, that's how the game continued. Let me see how the game continued. Yeah. Oh, white didn't play e5. In the game, white didn't play e5. This position is completely and utterly lost for black. If black plays knight takes e5, then you can play knight e5, bishop e5, and who can spot the killer blow in this position? White does a move that ends the game immediately. This is a trick question, ladies and gentlemen, so take a little bit of time here. Be careful. Be careful. But just me saying that it's a trick question should lead you to suspect that rook e1 is not the best move. Black defends the knight with f6. White is still winning, but more accurate is bishop takes f7 check. Simple tactics, takes, rook g8, and white ends the game with rook e1 winning all of black's pieces. If black plays king e7, this is literally checkmate. Hello. So bishop takes e5 just gives white this overwhelming lead in development. Instead, the best move is knight t7. Hikaru has played this move. He's also played bishop e5 against me and won, pretty sure. So here, there's a very important concept, a move that forces black to ruin his own structure as well. This is incredibly common. Whenever you have a pawn that is condemned, this pawn is condemned, right? You're going to lose it anyway. Well, you don't give it away without a fight. You don't give it away without forcing some concessions. And so the best move here is to play e6, f takes e6. And according to my analysis, white just needs to play solid positional chess. It's plus over minus. It's like 0.8 in favor of white here. And it's not surprising. White has better development. The pawn on e6 is much weaker than its counterpart. And if black just proceeds nonchalantly, you're going to plant the dark squared bishop on d4 in order to neutralize its counterpart on g7. Let's say black, I don't know, let's say black castles. Of course, bishop c4. Of course, knight g5. The position plays itself, and I don't say that lightly. White's got fantastic chances in a position like this. What else is there? So in this position, I think that's basically it. I mean, black can also play bishop to e6 in order to try to prevent white from playing pawn to e6. But here, of course, you don't give away the pawn. Here, the loss of a tempo means that white will cling to this pawn on e5, which makes it very difficult for black to develop their knight to a good spot. Remember that h6 is almost always met here with the move h4. You want to prevent kingside expansion with g5. So this is one of the biggest draws of this line. A lot of people go into this endgame, and it's just virtually unplayable from a practical standpoint. Knight to f6 is the other move that you should be familiar with in this position. White, of course, responds with a developing move of our own. And if black plays knight to g4, as scary as this move looks, it's really not a big deal. And okay, there's many things that you can do here. I like the simple bishop up to f4. And generally, black again plays the move e5. If black just continues to develop, well, you're going to play h3. You're going to bring your queen up to d2. And I mean, look at white's incredible center, and white's attacking prospects on the king side are delicious. So I'm seeing a game in the database that went b5. Just a moment. I'm seeing a game that went b5. And white can play something like the engine likes e5, knight to d5, and bishop to h6, getting rid of black's dark squared bishop. Then you're going to play h4, h5, hg, and there will be hell to pay for black. So this is very one-sided. After bishop f4, black should play e5. And here we reach a slightly better version of this endgame for black, but white is still better. Takes, knight to d7, we play e6, f takes e6, and you can play a move like bishop to e2, okay? And after black castles, the engine actually likes keeping this bishop on this diagonal because there are some important squares on it. You don't want to go bishop g3 and walk into knight e3, right? So you want to keep the bishop here. You're going to castle. You're going to enjoy your life in an endgame like this. So that's an overview of pawn takes e4. Other moves aren't really worth talking about other than the best move, which is queen to b6. I'll get to it in a moment. If black plays knight f6, you get like a much improved version of the Gurgenidze, because here the knight can't easily get to f5. So this position just sucks for black. And you don't have to play f4, but I think this makes sense. And then you're going to go knight f3, and potentially you're just going to go like h4 and blast through on the king side. So the best move, and the move that not a lot of people know at an intermediate level, is queen to b6. I had a game here, a classical game against Alex Lenderman, who's a top American GM in 2011, which I managed to win. And the best move for white is just to ignore the threat on b2 and play the move queen to d2. Black has to know to accept the sacrifice. It's not really a sacrifice because you're going to win the pawn back. But to really, as a sales pitch for this line, I want to show you the start of my game against Lenderman to show you how difficult it is to handle this type of position for black. Let me find the game in the database. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It was slightly different. It was e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, knight c3, c6, bishop e3, and he immediately played the move queen b6. And this is a different version. I played queen d2, so I was almost right. Takes, rook b1, queen a3, knight f3. And this position is an improved version for white because black can't play d5 anymore. That square is now covered twice. But watch what happened in the Lenderman game. He played the move b5 in order to prevent the bishop from coming out to c4. Who can tell me how I punished his lack of development here? And there's a beautiful detail, a really nice move that would have finished the game immediately that I missed. Here, the move like plays itself. Like you just can't resist. Of course, it's bishop b5. Now, Lenderman saw this. He accepts my bishop. Here, I started to get very excited. And this is the position that he was aiming for. I missed the best move. I played knight c7. And after king d8, we had total and complete chaos. White, however, is winning on the spot with an incredible move. This is really beautiful. Let's see if anybody can find it. Pause the video if you're on YouTube. Maybe take a good like 3 to 5 minutes here if you really want to work your tactical brain. Not castles. That's a little slow. Castles is slow. No, it's not castles. If you castle, then black will defend the c7 square with knight a6, and you say, oh, I trapped the queen. You don't. The queen has c4. And that's a hint. c4 is the only evacuation square that the queen has. You got it. Sardine, you earned a sub. Or everybody who answered is a sub. Queen to c3 ends the game immediately. Because if black takes with check, you bring the king up, black loses the queen. Because if he takes, you get checkmated on c8. Now, this is a very high-level move. If black plays knight to a6 in order to defend the bishop, you win the game with the secondary idea. Rook to a1. There's no more c4 square, and queen e6 runs into rook takes a6, and black loses everything. Actually, black loses the queen because of knight c7. Now, the game could last a little bit longer because black has a rook and a piece for the queen, but it's like +6. Obviously, white's just crushing. So this just gives you a sense of how difficult these positions are to play. But unfortunately, we're talking here about a slightly different version. Here with the pawn on d5, it's improved. But after queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3. Actually, I was wrong. Yeah, because in the Lennerman game, my knight was on f3. So that's the main reason this is an improved version for black. Here you play e takes d5, and I still maintain that this is a much easier position to play for white, but it is equal. And it's equal if black knows the move knight to f6, first of all. You bring the bishop out, I'm pretty sure, according to what I looked at. No, you play d takes c6. And here black has to know another move. Knight takes c6 is a bad move because of d5, and white gets a big initiative. You have to know the move bc, which is far from intuitive, I think. White develops the bishop to d3. Castles, knight g2. White is a very compact position. And again, engine gives equal, but black has to know more engine moves like bishop to a6. And finally, this position is equal for obvious reasons. I mean, black has good, well-placed pieces, but so does white. So it's one of those things. If your opponent knows all of these moves, if you watch this video, kudos. You know, take your hat off. Sometimes you just have to admit that your opponent knows everything. But I don't think that you're going to face this sequence of moves all that often. You're going to face knight f6 or pawn takes e4. Some people are going to probably go knight h6, which is really dumb because of queen d2, sending the knight right back to g8. Okay, so finally we get to our opponent's move, which is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, e5 is a legitimate alternative, but I'm pretty sure that it hands over a big initiative after pawn and a big advantage after pawn takes e5. Okay, so bishop takes e5, and we played the move e takes d5, which is normal according to the computer. The computer also likes the immediate bishop to d4, which came across our radar. I mean, this is not an engine move. It's a pretty obvious idea. And according to the computer, forcing this bishop off the board would give white a big advantage, like plus 1.5. And in my move, it's around plus 0.8. So it's not a mistake, but bishop d4 is even more accurate. What was I worried about here? I thought the black would go here. But apparently, after you trade, you just go queen d2, and white's huge development advantage gives him just an overwhelming position. Wherever black goes, you're now going to castle. And black can't take on e4 because of the mate. And if black castles, then you say thank you very much for the pawn. Takes, takes, takes. And white is much better. So bishop d4 would have been best, but instead we played e takes d5, which I think is perfectly suitable. C takes d5, and of course we bring our queen up to d2. And white has a small-ish but very stable advantage, and most importantly, this is much easier position to play for white. So hopefully that overview was sensible and you understood all of the main ideas. So here we develop our pieces: knight e7, castles, bishop e6. I think this is quite normal and obvious without commentary. The next interesting moment really occurred after we played knight d4. Black played queen d7, and I feel like black embarks fundamentally on the wrong plan. I just feel like castling queenside here opens black up to so many problems in the center and on the queen side. I would go so far as to say that at a title player level, castling queenside might be close to the decisive mistake. What would I do instead here? for black? Well, the move that concerned me the most was actually a very simple approach where black trades off all the pieces that he can and castles kingside. And I did mention during the game that piece trades favor the side that plays against the IQP. Well, yes, but here black has bigger fish to fry. In particular, black wants to avoid getting checkmated. And the queen on d4 is not a good blockader, right? By trading, you've essentially lured the queen onto d4, where it can be susceptible to, of course, the move knight f5 or to the move knight c6. And if white plays h4, black can play knight c6. And if we play queen d2, black can push d4. And it's quite clear that black has generated serious counterplay against the queen side. According to the engine, white is still quite a bit better with knight e4, because queen d5 runs into the fork and bishop takes a2 is very dubious on account of the typical b3. So white is still better, but black's position remains quite playable. Maybe this is a better option after queen d2, d4. Here, this comes with far greater effect because the knight can get into e3. So something like this, I think, would have given black a defensible position. After queen d7, bishop b5, long castle, and king b1 is maybe less to the point than a move like rook he1. But I just wanted to illustrate how pleasant positions like this are to play and how you really just need to kind of enjoy positions like this. And moves like king b1 signify that you're not in any massive hurry to do something crazy. Just make these improving moves and you will notice how your opponent often just collapses on their own. King b8, and now a very important move. Bishop f4, trading off our opponent's strongest piece. Was this the only move? No. Probably the computer would prefer something more straightforward like rook he1. But it's a very sensible move because we are leaving black with a terrible bishop on e6 that's essentially just a big pawn. So bishop f4, queen f4, and I think another mistake is the move king a8. I think queen c7 should have been preferred, essentially forcing our hand. Our opponent gave us too many free moves. He let us bring all our pieces to great squares. I mean, it's no surprise then that we had a game-winning tactic. Literally all of our pieces are located on perfect squares. When that is the case, you just automatically need to search for tactics. If you're looking at your position, you're saying, wait a second, everything is placed perfectly, it's all staring at crucial files and weaknesses, you better start looking for tactics. Okay, so queen c7, I think, was black's last chance to attain a defensible position. I might even have taken on c7 and taken on c6, something like this. The engine actually likes this, because after bc, rook he1, again, black is under tremendous pressure on the e-file, and rook to d6 is possible, but now we can target the square on c5. Whenever you have a structure that involves hanging pawns on c6 and d5, your sort of traditional textbook plan involves what I call the Rubinstein maneuver. And I've named it after Akiba Rubinstein, who demonstrated a perfect way to play against this pawn chain, c6 and d5. What idea am I talking about? What square are we trying to occupy and with what piece? And for what purpose? But if you want, you can just name the square. So don't touch the knight on d4. It's perfect. The knight on d4 is serving an important purpose, but the other knight is unemployed, and we want to go knight a4 and knight c5. By occupying the second blockading square, we're completely immobilizing this pawn chain. It's the same principle as occupying the d4 or d5 square when one side has an IQP. Here is a very quick run-through of the Rubinstein game that I'm talking about. Thing is, these two players, Rubinstein and his opponent was Georg Salve, who was one of the top players of that time. Yeah, basically what happened in this game was a situation in which black got that structure, okay? And white did exactly what we just discussed. White brings his pieces out. Knight a4, there it is. And white piles up on the c5 square with everything that he's got. Rook c1, bishop c5, there it is. And everything is all about the c5 square. By keeping this square under control, you're ensuring that c6 remains a weakness forever. Watch what Rubinstein does. Bishop f1, e3. Get the knight to c5. Blockade the square. Bring the rook to c2. b4, fully ensconcing the rook on c5. And eventually Rubinstein has some tactics. The rule applies here as well. In this position, all of Rubinstein's pieces are in perfect squares. The bishop, the rook, the queen, the other rook. And guess what? There is a tactic that involves rook takes c6 and queen takes a7. At one moment, I'll invest more time in this game because there's a lot to talk about. But I'm for those watching on YouTube, this has been a 6-hour stream, and I'm basically exhausted already. So I'm going to leave that for another occasion. And the final thing to discuss is how exactly we saw knight e6 and knight e4, because after this move, I think everything was incredibly straightforward. Once we win this pawn, the game is over. Let's be real. But how do you find moves like this? Well, one piece of advice is everything is placed perfectly. Look for tactics. But the other things I mentioned during the game, there's contact on the d file between the rooks. Any contact between heavy pieces is automatically a source of tactics, particularly because the rook on d6 is undefended. The other thing to remember is that you should not get fixated on maintaining one particular pawn structure. You should not be afraid to alter the pawn structure your opponent has in order to shift the object of attack from one file to another. And this is the case here. You just have to consider this capture because it's obvious that you want to go after one of black's pawns. So seeing these two moves is just a matter of, calculating the stuff that you're supposed to calculate. And then seeing knight e4 is a matter of being aware of the placement of the rooks, the fact that the rook on d6 is undefended, and ultimately knight e4 should come to mind, right? More often than not, which is not to say you're going to see all of these moves, but when you solve and you go through this process, you're just trying to raise the probability that you find certain things. Knight g5, knight takes c6, and the rest, I think, is very evident without commentary. We got our bishop back to b3 to attack d5. We played the very patient move c3, and then we pounced on the opportunity to win the knight on e7. We didn't tunnel vision on the d5 pawn. This, by the way, I thought was a little bit more messy because the knight on e6 is pinned to the rook. The engine indicates that it's completely winning with rook e4. I didn't see this move. But why? Why bother when we can make a patient move that keeps all of our advantages and reserves the right to take on d5 whenever we want to? Yeah, some of you were asking about bishop takes d5. So again, hopefully the object of my worry is obvious. I also, for some reason, was a little concerned about knight d8. Of course, I missed from a distance that you have knight c7 check, which is a simple discovered attack. But if I had seen rook to e4, I would have probably gone for this because this is like concretely unbeatable. Black can't even go rook e8 because again, there's knight c7 again. And you win the rook in a different way. So this is just 2 pawns up. Also, from the corner of my eye, I thought maybe this move is going to be annoying, but you can just drop the rook back to d2, and then again, you can play rook e4 on the next move. All right, guys, I think everything is clear. So what we had was a summary of the theory after f3. Remember, queen b6 is the best move. Still doesn't solve all of black's problems. e5 happened in the game. D takes e4 is what I spent the most time on. Then we could have played bishop d4 in this position to immediately target black's strongest piece. This was a sub-theme of the game, targeting your opponent's strongest pieces. The other main theme was patience, right? This game was all about patience. It started here, where knight takes d5, super impatient move, would allow either a big lead in development or chaos after bishop takes b2, neither of which we want. So we patiently develop our queenside. Then patience in this part of the game where we just bring our pieces and put them on good squares because we have the time to do that. Trading off your opponent's strongest piece, rook he1, and then tactical awareness at the right moments, right? Understanding that when everything is well placed, you're likely to have some way to convert the positional advantage into something more tactical. That's what I was able to do by bringing the knight to g5, winning the pawn, and the technical phase of the game was very straightforward. Thanks for hanging out, everybody.